the yes. Due to those of my students in GWS 210 who are joining us over Zoom after the very blustery night. Thank you for taking this time to be with us in our conversation with Sarah Schulman, and I am going to pass things over to P. Carl, and we're very glad to have him here to introduce her and to get things started. So take it away, Carl.
All right. Yeah, I'm P. Carl, and I'm a visiting scholar at URI this semester, and I have the pleasure of having invited Sarah Schulman here with us this evening, who is, I mean, I was sitting racking my brain this afternoon to think of an activist who's had more impact on the politics of this culture, and I'm struggling to think of someone, so I'm just going to give you a brief bio of Sarah, and we're going to talk. Mostly Sarah's going to talk, and then we'll take some questions and go for an hour. So Sarah is the author of more than 20 works of fiction, nonfiction, and theater, producer and screenwriter of several feature films, and a distinguished professor at the College of Staten Island, and a fellow at the New York Institute for the Humanities, and recipient of fellowships from MacDowell, Yaddo, and the New York Foundation of the Arts. And in 2018 was presented the Publishing Triangle's Bill Whitehead Award for Lifetime Achievement. And I think that says it all, lifetime achievement, and still achieving a lifetime of writing. So I don't think you're done. I don't think this is your last book, is my guess. One of the reasons asking Sarah to come, besides the fact that activism is a part of the course, is in part to talk about her new book, which I will, it is, I'll give you just so you can see it, that it's actually this big for people who don't know, and it is called Let the Record Show, and it's a political history of ACT UP from 1987 to 93, and so Sarah, I just, I kind of just want to start off with a quick, I know your kind of background story, but if you could share with people, like, how did you get, I mean, you've been an activist since the get-go and you've never let up. How did it start for you? Was it always there? Was there an inciting incident that propelled you into the world of activism, or?
Well, I come from a Holocaust family. So I was born in 1958, which is, 13 years after the end of the Holocaust. And my grandmother had 2 brothers and 2 sisters who were exterminated in the Holocaust, and my grandfather's sister. So I was raised, and this was at a time when children were not protected from the truth of the world. So, I was raised with this knowledge of the bystander, the guilty bystander, the person who stands by and allows injustice and cataclysm to occur. And my family insisted on that as a reality. And I was given the Diary of Anne Frank to read when I was like 6 or 7. But, what I took away from it was that girls could be writers. And I think a lot of girls who were born in the 50s started writing diaries after they read the Diary of Anne Frank. So it kind of had this double message about writing, but also about history and witnessing and telling the truth of what had occurred. And then my mother was a social worker, and she used to take us to those anti-war against the Vietnam War rallies in Washington, D.C. on the bus of the National Association of Social Workers that had no heat. And we'd be getting on at 3 a.m, and then showing up in Washington. So I was kind of like trained for that. But my family, unfortunately, turned out to be homophobic and anti-Arab. So they had certain kinds of things that they understood and then things that they couldn't. And I have found that, the challenge is to extend from your own category and your own experience to universalize to other human beings. And that's the ever evolving growth and challenge of being a person.
Yeah, I mean, that leads exactly to a kind of the next question, uh, because we're in this very strange time of what I would call intense conflict among, I think, people who have more in common than, not in common in terms of certain issues, and yet there is a lot of sense of there's one way, there's either a right answer or a wrong answer, and you wrote this incredible book, Conflict is Not Abuse, and I wonder, which emphasizes, I think, your what you just said, which is your real respect for, need for diversity of thought. And I wonder if you could just talk a little bit about where you think that book and that idea of the importance of diversity of thought sits right now in the public discourse.
Well, it really is evident when looking at ACT UP. So let me tell a little bit about ACT UP and then come back to that question and how it's situated there. Yeah, so just so people know, AIDS is something that probably has existed for 100 years. And we now realize that it was in America in the 1940s and it came to New York in the 60s and 70s. But science didn't observe the pattern until 1981. And at the time, gay people were a profoundly oppressed group in this country. Gay sex was illegal. Sodomy laws were not overturned federally until 2003. And even in New York City, there was no gay rights bill. So people could be fired from a job or kicked out of housing or denied public accommodation, service in a restaurant, this sort of thing. And familial homophobia was the norm. It was culturally virulent. Street violence against gay people, which was called gay bashing, was very common, and there was no recourse. So this virus hit at a moment where people were very oppressed and very separate from any kind of protection. And in the first 5 years of the virus, 40,000 people died in this country, and the government did nothing, and pharma did nothing. And then finally, in 1987, ACT UP, the AIDS Coalition to Unleash Power, was formed. And this was a direct action grassroots movement of people who had no rights. And it was a broad coalition. And their victories were astounding. I mean, in the 6 years that I cover in my book, just to tell you some of the things ACT UP achieved, they forced science to change the way it studied the disease so that it met the needs of people who were sick instead of the needs of scientists. They forced the Food and Drug Administration to release experimental treatments for people who needed it, even if it hadn't gone through approval process. We forced the CDC and Social Security to make benefits available to women with AIDS who were excluded from any kind of treatment or support. ACT UP made needle exchange legal in New York City. ACT UP took on the Catholic Church and stopped them from inhibiting the distribution of condoms in the public schools. ACT UP made HIV, removed it as a pre-existing condition, and so made it that people who had HIV could buy private insurance, and this affected about 500,000 people. So, I think it's very important for us at a time like today, which is to get back to your question, when so many of us need and want profound change in this country, to look at a movement that was able to achieve a lot and to try to understand how they did it. Mm-hmm. And it's very difficult to get access to activist information. It takes a lot. I interviewed 188 people over 18 years. Plus I was in the movement, So to get back to your question, one of the key reasons that ACT UP was as successful as it was is that it was not a consensus-based movement. In other words, you did not have to agree in order to go forward. Now, they had a bottom line, and that is very important. People have to have a bottom line of what their values are. And ACT UP's bottom line was one line. It was direct action to end the AIDS crisis. And that was direct action as opposed to social service provision. But if you were doing direct action to end the AIDS crisis, basically you could do whatever you wanted. And if I didn't agree with you, if you had an idea and I didn't like it, I would argue with you, because this was pre-gentrification New York and people put their feelings out there in a big way. But in the end, I wouldn't try to stop you from doing it. I just wouldn't do it if I didn't agree with you. And I would go find people who wanted to do what I wanted to do, and we would do that. And this kind of radical democracy, right? This is what enabled so many different kinds of campaigns to come out of this organization at the same time, in so many different social levels, with different aesthetics, with different game plans, because people were allowed to respond from where they were at. And a good movement that has radical democracy facilitates people being effective from where they are at, because you cannot make people be anywhere but where they're at. And you cannot force them to be where you're at. You know, so movements that try to force everybody into homogeneity, into one analysis or one strategy, they have all failed. And I don't think that there's a single exception to that. But you must have a bottom line so you know what your values are. And this is a great model for us today, because we're at a time when so many communities are in trouble in this country. And so many people need change, that if you could only work with people that you agree with on everything, you're not going to be able to work with anybody. So what we need is big tent politics, where people who are very different but have some overlapping interests can cooperate on the things that they agree on without trying to force agreement on other things. And you also have to know who are the people that you don't agree with at all. That has to be clear also.
Yeah, I mean, you know, such a you know, it seems so you know, obvious at one level, but you know, we have gotten farther and farther away, I think, from that even being possible. And I wonder what you think is, you know, what do you think is in the way of having a movement like that? I mean, you could feel around, for example, the election of 2020, a sense of a rare moment of consensus, you know, a large group of people who went about their activism in many different ways in terms of getting, you know, ultimately Biden elected. And I wonder what, you know, how you kind of locate the more than one problem, but what allows these kind of broader coalitions to function. I know there's, you know, Black Lives Matter, and you know, there are a few that have come together, but the change part seems, you know, I think what was so significant about ACT UP was the change came.
I think the focus has to be on being effective. And being effective means having demands that are reasonable, winnable, and doable. And let me go into a little bit more detail on that. You know, interestingly, when I started writing the book, I went back and reread Martin Luther King's 1964 article, Letter from Birmingham Jail. And there he famously lays out his concept of direct action. And actually, it is exactly what ACT UP did, even though we never discussed it. No one ever said, this is like, we should learn from Dr. King. And I think it's because our generation in ACT UP, we were born in the 40s, 50s, and 60s. And although we were gay kids in those days, there was no such concept as gay kids. So we grew up seeing Black resistance on television, and we saw Black people stand up to the police and do nonviolent civil disobedience and do direct action, like sitting in at segregated lunch counters. And I think we internalized that and identified with it and ended up using pretty much the same strategy. So let me just sort of lay out what that strategy is. So the first thing is that you become the expert on your issue. And this is very important. A big mistake that people make is taking an infantilized relationship to power, where you're begging the powers that be to solve the problem. They are never going to solve the problem. They don't want to solve the problem, and they don't know how. So you have to get the agency to be the expert. And this happened in ACT UP. People with no science background learned all the science. They learned how the media worked. You know, they became experts, and you designed the solution. So like when the FDA was not letting people with AIDS get experimental drugs, people from ACT UP who had no background in government, they studied how the FDA worked. And they figured out a way that the FDA could get those drugs released. And they put out a plan, and they called it parallel track. And they presented it to Fauci, who was still in charge back then, and had a big demonstration and forced them to do it. You know, so that's number one. You design the solution, and your solution should be reasonable, winnable, and doable. Number two is that you present your solution to the powers that be. And when they refuse, you do what Dr. King called self-purification, or what ACT UP called nonviolent civil disobedience training. And you do a nonviolent civil disobedience that is theatrical, so that you communicate through the media to the public what the issue is and that you have the solution to this issue. And in this way, you pressure. And this works whether your opponent is the administration of a university, or whether it's a city council, or whether it's a private corporation. You know, this is a system, this really works. And you're building a campaign. The worst thing you can do is have a demonstration where there's no demands, and all the people who come to it, you don't give them anything to do when they leave. Then you're just wasting people's energy. But if you have your solution, which is your demand, then all of your actions are building your demand. And that's called a campaign. Now, what's interesting about ACT UP is, you know, AIDS, and just for younger people to understand, AIDS is like a terrible disease. I mean, people really suffered, and we were very young, and we watched our friends suffer and die. So we were very motivated. What AIDS is like it's an umbrella term like cancer. It's different in each person. And what it means is that your immune system no longer works. So as your immune system breaks down, you start to get these symptoms like dementia, blindness, skin cancer. You can no longer process nutrition. The nerves in your legs swell and you can't walk. And each of these symptoms is called an opportunistic infection. Now, people with AIDS wanted science to research treatments for each of those opportunistic infections so that when they got sick, they could be treated. But the pharmaceutical companies were not motivated to break it down that way because it was smaller market shares. They wanted like a pill that you would take to make your AIDS go away because that was the largest market share, but there was no such thing. So people with AIDS had to fight because they were dying and the clock was ticking and they needed treatments for these opportunistic infections. And that's what made ACT UP be effective, because it listened to the needs of the people who were having the problem. And it's the people who are the most vulnerable in your movement who are the ones who should be dictating what the agenda is. You know, because if people are in a state of emergency, like with the evictions that are going on around the country, the fact that no one in this country has a place to live, and that, you know, the price of housing is outrageous all around this entire country. If someone's being evicted, they need a movement that's going to get them housing right now. They can't sit around and wait. And so you focus, you can have long-term policy goals, but you also need to meet the needs of people in the moment. And, you know, one of my favorite slogans in organizing is think globally, but act locally. So you look at the world that you live in, the people you know, what are the needs that you see? What are the needs that you see on your block? And how can you help those people? What do they need? Are you living in a community where the water is not clean? Yes, we have global climate change, and yes, we need global reform. But what is your local immediate need of the people in your life? And what would it take for your locality to change? And that's what's going to make you go forward and be as effective as you can.
Yeah, I mean, that is so powerful in terms of just, I think, the overwhelm that, at least for, you know, I teach in a college, you teach in a college, and we're talking to a college. Often talking to students is like where to start. You know, you say climate change, and everybody just goes, what, you know, and so I think that is, you know, just to be able to have some concrete things that you are doing. I wonder if you'd talk a little bit about the theatricality of the ACT UP activism, because that was one of the things that was really remarkable to me, and, you know, as I participated in some of those actions, but also and saw many of them. It's funny that you talk about there wasn't consensus, because there was such a sense of purpose, agreed upon purpose in, you know, most of the actions that took place, and the theatricality, I think, is one of the things that made it different than other kinds of activism I had seen. So, you know.
Yeah, well, you know, when you have like a traditional demonstration where like people stand out in the rain and they're looking at a stage and there's people making boring speeches after boring speeches, it's very disempowering and it doesn't help anybody. But direct action is participatory, and everybody is doing it together. And, you know, the really classic example, just to go back to what I was talking about earlier, in the Black movement in the 60s, So there were segregated lunch counters in public places, whites only lunch counters, and students, Black students, wanted that to end. But instead of just marching outside with signs saying end segregated lunch counters, they actually went in and sat down at the white only lunch counter. And so they created an image of the world that they wanted to create. They created an image of integration, and they were treated with violence and they were arrested. But the whole world saw that image. And that is like one of the most brilliant classic theatrical direct actions that has ever taken place. Because you want to put in the viewer's mind what your vision is of the just world. And that's what helps you go forward.
Yeah. Yeah, you talked about the in the book you talk about I haven't finished the entire book, I will admit, but I'm rolling along. In the book you talk about your one of the impetus for the oral history project that is part of the foundation of the book, the 188 interviews, that it was partly because the history of ACT UP and the movement, as the effectiveness of it was being kind of watered down and as you say, represented by the New York crimes, otherwise known as the New York Times, and so I would wonder if you could talk a little bit about how it was being, how it kind of shrunk down, and then a little bit about maybe the structure of the book as antidote to that.
Yeah, so, we have this myth, American myth, that's kind of based on John Wayne. It's like the heroic white male individual who comes in and fixes everything. And not only is that inaccurate, but it's also impossible. And if people are looking for that as a solution, they will fail because it doesn't work. Because in America, things change by coalition. And so building communities and building collectivity and relationships between communities is how we get change in this country. And the story of ACT UP was being simplified down to 5 or 6 white individuals who were being presented as the heroes, and all these other people's role were being ignored. And not only is it not true, but it gives activists the wrong message about how to go forward. In my book, I have 140 people who I discuss, and that's only about a third of, who was really key in the movement, because it was a participatory movement in which everyone who was in it was doing something to have things go forward. So, there were people who were working on medications and treatments, definitely, but there was a housing committee that was fighting for housing for homeless people with AIDS. There was an insurance committee trying to get people with AIDS to be covered. There were people working with incarcerated people with AIDS. There was a huge movement to make needle exchange legal in New York, and they are quite phenomenal. It was active and former drug users inside ACT UP who knew that that harm reduction, which was a brand new concept at the time, was the thing that would keep people alive. That, there was the idea at the time about drug use was abstinence only, that the only alternative for drug users was to completely stop using drugs immediately. And any policy that didn't do that was not supported. But people in ACT UP understood this idea of harm reduction, that if you can get people in a place where they're safer, it's better. And they had the slogan, dead addicts can't recover. Like by getting a clean needle, someone might live long enough to be able to deal with their addiction. So people from ACT UP went and illegally but publicly exchanged needles on the street in order to get arrested so that they could have a test trial where they could argue that they did it out of necessity. Now that is a very high risk strategy, but they won. And needle exchange became legal in New York. And that was a main way that people got infected with HIV in New York. There were people in ACT UP who were working with children who were born HIV infected. There were so many different realms of activity. And if you remove that from the story, then you don't understand what actually was happening, which is this simultaneity of action in all of these different realms at the same time, where people were working in their own communities or with issues that they related to personally, but simultaneously. and supporting each other. And that's what made the paradigm shift. If everyone is only doing the same thing, you don't have that same kind of broad impact and reach.
Yeah, I think that's really and you know, you did this, I mean, painstaking effort to show that in terms of like, and that is so rare, as you say. You mostly get the John Wayne version of you know, I mean, I think people would say, oh, Larry Kramer, you know, and Larry Kramer did a lot of amazing things, but obviously not singularly, right? And so, you know, I think about that in terms of the book. Like, one is, I mean, this was an enormously long project, and I wonder if you just talk about, like, you know, putting it together, the importance of the chronicling of history this way, because it seems, you know, we're in this this strange period of people talking about critical race theory as if it's a theory rather than just history, right? And basically we're going, you know, going back and finding the history that's somewhere, but we, you know, we were never taught it, right? And you have to kind of, it's like sort of hidden. And so I'm wondering about, like, you know, this responsibility to chronicle history, why you took it on, and how long it took you. Why the book?
I mean, I really started.
When was the book finished? How do you decide a book this long is ready to be published? You know,
I mean, I really started before AIDS was even acknowledged, because in the late 70s, so at that time, there was no gay content in any kind of commercial media. You could not turn on the TV and hear about gay people. You couldn't open a newspaper and read about gay people. It was all hidden. So feminists and queer people had our own media, and almost every city had a feminist newspaper and a gay and lesbian newspaper, and some had more than that. And this was national. And there was like an army of journalists like myself, I was 21 at the time, who were just out there. We were working for free. We took it extremely seriously. And we were like, what are the stories? What's happening to our communities? What are the real issues? And we were, you know, huge numbers of people were reading these publications about themselves and their own news. So at that point, I was at City Hall covering the fact that there was no gay rights bill in New York when AIDS was discovered in 1981. And in the next few years, I covered a number of stories related to the very early days of AIDS. So one of the stories I worked on was pediatric AIDS. A lot of children were born HIV positive in New York City at the time. Now there are drugs so that if a woman is HIV positive and pregnant, her child will not be born positive. But at the time there weren't. And there was a lot of issues about that. I covered the fact that women were excluded from experimental drugs, and women couldn't get treatment, and women couldn't get benefits, and I wrote about that. But I also covered things like gay male sex clubs were closed by the city health department, and I got the assignment to cover that. Now that's very strange, because of course I'd never been in a gay male sex club. Women were not allowed in those clubs. But the reason I was assigned to this was because everything was so chaotic. You know, journalists were dying, editors were dying. I had an editor at the Village Voice, Robert Massa, who gave me the edit in his pajamas in his apartment because he was too sick to go to the office. So they were just like, go cover that, you know. So it was just very, very chaotic time. Then by the time ACT UP was founded in 1987, I'd already been writing about AIDS for about 5 years. So when I came into ACT UP, you know, and I continued to cover AIDS. Then I left ACT UP around 92 or 93. And this was a period where the biggest victories of ACT UP were now coming to an end. And there was a number of years where there was no medical progress, and so many people were dying, and it was absolutely horrible. And people in ACT UP were very depressed, and the organization split, and it was bad. Then in 96 is when the good drugs finally became available. And that was the first time that a person who was infected with HIV could start taking a drug that could give them a full lifespan. 1999 was the internet revolution. So this whole movement was before the internet. There was no email, there was no YouTube. When we had to share a video, we had to put it in an envelope and mail it in a mailbox, and it would arrive in somebody's house. The best way you exchange information was by going to another city and sitting down with people and telling them what you were doing, and they would tell you what they were doing. It was all in a whole other system. So when the internet came in and everyone was on it, ACT UP's materials had not been digitized, and we were like disappeared. You could Google ACT UP and find almost nothing. So in 2001, which is now 20 years since AIDS was first noticed, I was driving in a car and I was listening to the radio. They were having some programming about the 20th anniversary of AIDS. And the guy said, at first, America had trouble with people with AIDS, but then they came around. And I almost crashed the car. I thought, oh no, that is not what happened. And I just had this panic, like there's going to be this fake history about how benevolent everybody was and this natural progress. And we're just such a good society. When the truth is that thousands of people fought until the day they died to force this country to change against its will. You know, and I was like, so I pulled the car over and I called my collaborator, Jim Hubbard. And one of the many things that we share is a great sense of responsibility for our dead friends. So we felt that we had to start historicizing this. So we had this idea. We got money from the Ford Foundation from Urvashi Vad, who was a lesbian leader, still one of our great leaders. And we started interviewing people. And our idea was that we were going to put the interviews up for free on this website. The website is actuporalhistory.org. And some academic somewhere would take this material and analyze it, and we would be providing all this data. Well, a lot of people have read it. I mean, we've had 14 million hits on our website, and we made all the transcripts available for free, and 650,000 people have downloaded transcripts, but nobody was working with the material. And I conducted all but 2 of the interviews, and the years were going by and we're posting everything, and nobody was processing it or reading it. And then this fake history started to emerge. One day, I had written an article for the New York Times and I had mentioned something about ACT UP, and the editor changed it to Larry Kramer's ACT UP. And I thought, oh no, this cannot be. This is a movement of hundreds, of people. Internationally, there are 148 chapters. This is thousands of people. You can't make this one person's movement. And so Jim Hubbard, my collaborator as a filmmaker, he had been collecting archival footage. Now, this is fascinating. When AIDS first started, there was no technology for recording off a television set. And people didn't have video cameras. They still had film cameras with 16 millimeter and Super 8 film. And they were pointing film cameras at television screens and filming the TV. That was the way people were recording. Then video was invented, beta video, which was that one person carried a deck that was the size of a huge suitcase. And the other person had this big boom microphone. But suddenly the camcorder was invented, this little video camera, and that's ACT UP was the first movement to have video that people could control, and they invented video activism. So Jim had collected 2,000 hours of archival footage in all of these different kinds of formats and in film, and he digitized it all. And so combining that with the interviews, he directed a film called United in Anger, The History of ACT UP, which people can watch for free on YouTube. We're all about everything being for free. So all our material is open access. And, we tried to get the word out there, and we literally took the film on airplanes all around the world. We showed it in Brazil and Palestine and Russia and Lebanon and India, because there's people with AIDS all over the world. Right. But the story of like the 5 white people who've saved everything was getting bigger and bigger and bigger. And it became like a crisis. And we're like, oh no, somebody has to write this book. And I didn't want to do it because I'm a novelist. We tried to find other people, but we couldn't find anybody. And finally I was like, oh my God, I'm going to have to do it. So I sat down, I took about 3 years. I reread all of the interviews and I started to cohere, like I started to see tropes and patterns in what people said. And the very first thing I realized was that this story could not be told chronologically, because chronologically it would not be accurate, because so many things happen at the same time. And it was that simultaneity is what made the movement powerful. So I cohered tropes and I cohered moments. And I juxtaposed them to try to produce a sense of the larger feel. And that's how it got as big as it did. And my editor said, you can't go over 800 pages. So there you are. And that's how we started.
So it was done then at the end at 8:01, right? I'll do a quick tangent and then I'll open for questions. I just have to say, you are a novelist and have written many novels, and it's interesting just to think about the way in which your writing has cohered coalitions of people for a long time, and your wonderful novels of mostly the 90s, some of the were those the earliest ones? Probably they're earlier, I don't know, but anyway, I read them in the 90s. I'll date myself, but every queer person I knew all of your novels and read all of your novels, and there was such a dearth of stories about queer people and queer women, and you have always been at the sort of forefront of the first person who fills this gap. And so your novels were, I can name dozens and dozens of people who your novels were critical to a sense of feeling like they existed in a culture where they were erased, right? And so I thank you for that, but also just I want to make sure that people know the diversity of interventions you have made into the conversations about queer life. So I want to give people a chance to ask questions, and if you want to either raise your hand or just jump in. Raise your hand as in that little emoji thing, but however you want to dive in.
I'm still a novelist, by the way.
I know you are. Yes. No.
Okay.
I actually I want to ask you what you're writing, but yes, I just wanted to say, at that moment there were no novels like what you were doing, right? Yeah.
Thank you, Carl.
So I have a question, Sarah.
Mm-hmm.
I'm also a novelist, though not nearly so as you are. Have you read The Great Believers?
Yes.
Might you share some thoughts on it?
I did a public conversation with Rebecca Mackay at the Toronto Public Library. And I had some questions about some of the representations, and I asked her if she had real life examples. And one of the things that I was troubled by is that one of the plot points is that this man comes home from work to his apartment that he shares with his boyfriend in Chicago in the 1980s. And his lover's mother is sitting there waiting for him. And he says, "What's the matter?" And the mother says, "Your boyfriend, your partner has AIDS." And the guy packs his bag and leaves. And I thought that would never have occurred in a million years. Nobody would call their mother to tell their partner that they had AIDS, especially in 1985. And that was really, so I asked her if she had any real life examples or anyone who told her that was the case. And she said no.
Well,
So she did it strictly for the plot point, right?
Well, she had a bias, because she didn't understand how familial homophobia worked.
Right.
And so she was really going from a heterosexual model and extrapolating, but it doesn't work that way because people have different experiences based on what their rights are and what their representations are. And you have to keep that in mind when you're representing people who you're not.
Rob, you have a question.
I do. Am I coming through all right?
Yep, you are, huh?
All right. So this is wonderful. I could sit and listen all night if we could. So I'll just say really quickly, so I'm in the Department of History here at URI, and my area of focus is on the Black freedom struggle and but more broadly sort of political movements and so on. And what's really sort of fascinating to me is in hearing you talk about sort of the way that the sort of the trajectory of scholarship on AIDS activism, and I think more broadly about LGBTQ plus activism, how much it sort of mirrors a lot of what we found in trying to chronicle and document the Black freedom struggle. That you start with this top-down approach, you have great leaders, you have the charismatic people that get all the focus, and then suddenly people discover that, oh, it's more of a bottom-up kind of thing, and it's more of a there are local stories and there's multifaceted agendas, and you start to build, a much more rich narrative and account, of that. So I guess I've got I've got two questions, and you could choose to answer either one or neither one, I guess. So one of them is that when I teach the Black freedom struggle, what I struggle with is trying to deconstruct this traditional narrative that we have of the movement, and then I realize that the students don't actually know that traditional narrative or the main one that I'm trying to deconstruct. And so how do you strike that balance between getting them to understand some of the big major events and some of these names that they kind of need to be familiar with some of those more localized and kinds of stories, right? The other piece of that I'm sort of curious about is one of the things I also talk with my students about is that movements don't come out of nowhere, and that there's always stuff bubbling beneath the surface if you look before that, when a movement emerges, right? So it wasn't like all of a sudden folks in the 1960s suddenly said, oh man, we're angry about racism, I guess we better do something, right? And so I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit about maybe what some of those networks or what some of those foundations were that made ACT UP possible, that was sort of beneath the surface.
Yes, and I agree with you. No movement is discrete, and the gay movement in particular is misrepresented as discrete for a number of reasons. One is that a lot of people who were gay or in the gay movement but had been in other movements beforehand were in the closet in those movements previously, and that's not seen as a trajectory. But also because the left didn't want gay people. The Communist Party famously expelled gay people. The civil rights movement sidelined Bayard Rustin when he was exposed as gay. The feminist movement had a number of lesbian purges. Most of them have not been historicized yet. So the reason that there was an autonomous gay movement is because nobody else wanted us. And so it's more for those reasons, but when ACT UP started, when AIDS activism started, now it was a predominantly white gay male organization. The older men had had experience in gay liberation, but most of the younger men had not. But the women came from the previous feminist movement. So there were quite a few women who came from reproductive rights, which was very influential on ACT UP because of its patient-centered politics and also multi-issue thinking, and also came from the women's peace movement, which is where, I actually named the people in my book who literally brought nonviolent civil disobedience training from the women's peace movement into ACT UP. But there also were Latin American students. Now, this was the time of fascist dictatorships in Chile and Argentina, and there was quite a bit of exile to New York. And so there was a significant Latino population inside ACT UP. I think I named about 35 people, many of whom had come from Latin American and Mexico City student movements. So even though women and Latinos and some Black people in ACT UP were small in number, they had a much more political experience and were very much able to influence. Now, the other question that you raised is about, what is the dominant narrative that I'm addressing? So there's really two when it comes to AIDS. The first, unfortunately, is Pose. The TV show Pose on FX, it has had so much impact. I mean, so many people think that that is the history of AIDS. And what they did was they took key events from ACT UP history and kind of watered them down and then populated them with Black trans women. And there was a famous ACT UP action disrupting Mass at St. Patrick's Cathedral in December 1989. And Pose depicted that action as being participated in by Black trans women who in Pose were then arrested. But actually, those people did not exist. There were people of color at that demonstration, and there was a white trans woman who was arrested, but that story that they told was just made up in a writer's room in a corporate television show. Now, I recently got like this horrible review in Jewish Currents by someone saying I was transphobic because I didn't recognize the Black trans women who were arrested at St. Patrick's Cathedral, but they never existed. So you're competing with that. The other issue are things like Angels in America or Philadelphia, which grossly misrepresent the events. And I think one of the reasons that they were so popular and became so iconic, I mean, winning Oscar and Pulitzer Prize and all that, is because of the way that they misrepresented events. So like in Angels in America, the centerpiece is that a man abandons his partner because he has AIDS. I can tell you that this almost never occurred. I mean, it did occur, but it's a very, very rare event. And there's no political movement in that universe of this play. So gay people are sort of like betrayers who are anxiety ridden, and and just like in Philadelphia, the gay guy needs a lawyer, so he goes to a Denzel Washington, a homophobic lawyer. Well, in real life, he would go to a gay lawyer, but because the conceit is that gay people are alone and abandoned and weak and cowardly and betray each other, that's the conceit of these two pieces, and they were so highly rewarded, and so that's one of those are probably the most influential, and also Dallas Buyers Club, who takes the gay guys who created buyers clubs and makes them straight. Once again, that the straight people are morally superior and the gay people are cowardly or not there at all. So those, Hollywood has done a real disservice to AIDS representation.
Can I ask, have you seen the movie 1985? What do you
No.
what you might think of it? I'd be curious to hear what you thought about that film.
Other questions? Because I have more, as I always do. Do you think, Sarah, there's any value, any value at all in those misrepresentations? And what I'm asking is, as you know, it's like this, there's always this question of how you're reaching, for lack of a better word, a more mainstream population. And so when you think of Angels in America and ACT UP, is it as inaccurate as they are, is that making it worse? Is there any value to those kinds of things in your mind?
It's not the works themselves, right?
Yeah.
Artists should write whatever they want and say whatever they want. It's the receptions.
Yeah.
Why are works that depict queer people as helpless and alone and betrayers the works that are made iconic and the most highly rewarded? And in my book, Stage Struck, I show you, for example, another example of that is the musical Rent.
Oh,
right? Where the straight people with AIDS live and the gay people with AIDS die. Like, it's so distorted. And in my book, Stage Struck, I go to that year and I show you all the work about AIDS being done by people with AIDS, by women of color, by experimental artists, that was actually telling the truth about the experience and how these works were trashed or overlooked or marginalized, while the lying works that make the dominant culture comfortable are uplifted and people, are made iconic and wealthy for telling the world what it wants to hear. Because the truth is that people with AIDS were abandoned, but not by each other. They were abandoned by their families and by their society. And works that said that at that time were not rewarded.
Yeah. There's no competing narrative, in other words. Yes. Yes, Rosaria.
Yes, thank you, Carl. And Sarah, thank you so much. This is such an incredible conversation. And as a lesbian, I'm actually learning a lot. And I actually wanted to ask the question about the role of lesbians in ACT UP and how they work together with gay men to in the direct actions and achieving the goals. There's so many goals that you mentioned. Could you speak a little bit more about the participation of lesbians in the movement and the collaboration between gay men and, yes.
Prior to AIDS activism, gay men operated as a kind of separatist community or separatist movement. They really were not interested in gay women or anything that they had to contribute. But AIDS was such an emergency, and women came in with all this expertise. So like some of the people I talk about, people like Marion Bonsoff and Risa Denenberg and Maxine Wolf, and who had been in the reproductive rights movement, and they knew how to think about these things. They understood issues about poor women, about people of color, about consent, about an unequal healthcare system. And they would do teach-ins. So one of the things about ACT UP that's so incredible is that because it was a participatory movement, everybody had to be informed. You couldn't just lean back and rely on the leaders. And there'd be all these teach-ins on these concepts like patient-centered politics, nonviolent civil disobedience training, multi-issue thinking, all of this came, and women knew how to run a meeting, for example. Men didn't know how to do that. Most of the lawyers were lesbians. I interviewed Lori Cohen, who actually processed 10,000 cases for ACT UP for free. I mean, nobody was paid. None of these people were paid. And when it came to fighting, and this is a very interesting strategy, when it came to fighting for women with HIV, so let me just give a little background. In the 1960s, there was a drug called thalidomide that was given to pregnant women, and a number of women had children born without limbs. And so they sued the pharmaceutical companies who had to pay out huge amounts of money. So from then on, they excluded women from experimental drug trials. So what that meant was that women with AIDS, if experimental drug trials were the only treatment, they couldn't get the treatments. They also had symptoms that were different than the men had, and so they didn't qualify for benefits. So they were really in a dire situation, and they tended to be poorer, they tended to be women of color, they tended to get diagnosed later and to die earlier. In fact, almost every woman with AIDS who was in ACT UP is dead now. At any rate, the way that women in ACT UP fought for women with HIV is that they never stopped the action to demand that the men do consciousness raising around sexism or something like that. They just very simply got the ample resources of the larger organization and used it for their constituency. So there was a small group of elite people in ACT UP, and they organized an art auction that raised $650,000. So when women with AIDS needed travel money to go testify at a hearing or stay in a hotel because they were sick or whatever, they didn't have to raise that money themselves. They would just go to fundraising and get the money. And that was how they did it. They kept their eye on their prize. They had their agenda for their constituency, and they used the resources of the community to do that. And Latinos did the same. When the Latino caucus saw that people with AIDS in Puerto Rico had no support, they just went to fundraising and got the money and went to Puerto Rico and started ACT UP Puerto Rico. So people were very, very wise about how not to waste their energy trying to change the dominant cultural people. You could spend your whole life trying to change one person and fail, right? So this is a good lesson, I think, for us today.
Thank you. Thank you.
Jody, you have your hand up.
I wanted to add an interesting tidbit, Sarah. So I'm a DES baby. My mother was one of millions given diethyl ethyl stibestrol, which for students who don't know, in the late 40s, early 50s, millions of women were given this drug because it supposedly prevented miscarriage, even though they knew that it was cancer causing in offspring. So when my twin sister died in 1988, before she died from a DES cancer, she sued the drug companies. And obviously I was deposed, right? Because the drug companies were keen to have their depositions. And one of their major arguments, just so students realize how true this discrimination against gay people was that because my twin was gay, she had cancer, and because I was straight, I did not. So
Yes.
just to add that to proof, really, it's for real. And I'm hoping it's not still for real.
Well, they're still saying that men who have sex with men should not donate blood, which is completely absurd. Because first of all, the blood supply is screened anyway. And if you're just relying on people reporting, self-reporting, people don't tell the truth anyway. So it's just a prejudicial, discriminatory measure. Thank you for sharing that.
Other questions that people want to ask? Well, I'm gonna, oh yeah, go ahead, Rosaria, yeah.
I think you're muted, Rosaria.
Oh, you're muted, Rosaria, yeah.
I was saying that I'm so impressed with hearing about the level of activism that ACT UP represented and how effective they were, and how they just brought community together in these very effective, meaningful ways, and how their work really ultimately contributed to the growth of the I guess the gay movement at the time. And now I wanted to ask you, what are your thoughts about how things are being perceived today within the LGBTQ plus group community? There seems to be a lot of tensions. especially between lesbians and transgender persons. There seems to be maybe potentially a lack of knowledge about this history and about the struggle among young queer individuals, again, standing on the shoulders of giants, kind of, or benefiting from all that struggle and suffering. Can you kind of speak a little bit about where you see the broader movement being today? It seems to me sort of splintered and confusing.
I mean, personally, I think that the LGBTQ, et cetera, rubric is an artificial one, and that each of those letters are having different experiences, and trying to force it all into one thing is not realistic. I think that when you look at, I think women are doing very poorly. And when you look at Supreme Court decisions, you can see that things that have to do with gay people, which is basically means gay men, because it's, that's what it means, have done much better in the courts. Women are in terrible shape, and so there's a real difference there. And we still see a huge wage gap between women and men. This lesbian trans thing, it's so disturbing and ahistorical. In 1992, I was a co-founder of the Lesbian Avengers. We had 22 chapters on 4 continents, and we voted 99-1 to include trans women in the Lesbian Avengers. There was no opposition to this. And while there is a tendency, there was a small group of people at that period who had an anti-trans analysis. It was minor. And I know people point at Janice Raymond and a couple of other people, but it was really just a handful of people who you can name. What's happening now is a new phenomenon. This doesn't have historic roots. And I don't really understand it. What I've been told is that British feminism has more of a history of an essentialist understanding about women's value that American feminism fortunately avoided. And that's why it's so hysterical and mean there. This discourse has dribbled down onto us here, but it doesn't make any sense. It's just that we're living in a time of intense scapegoating, and also that women's rights are being taken away, and women very much feel that. But the tendency in the culture, and this gets back to conflict is not abuse, is scapegoating. And we constantly see perpetrators positioning themselves as victims. That's the dominant discourse. I do want to say that I think abortion is the moral issue of our time domestically, just as I feel that the occupation of Palestine is the moral issue of our time internationally. And when you look at the failure of our movement to protect abortion rights, one of the things that I see as essential is that men never join that movement. And movements have to be places where people's lives get better by being in movements. And movements are places where people fall in love and have sex and come up with new ideas. And a movement that's based in heterosexual women alone cannot ultimately survive. It has to also be a place where heterosexual women can meet men and can have a sexual life, and that there's a frisson that moves the movement forward. And the fact that men have never joined in that movement, I think, has a lot to do with its decline. Because the truth is, we haven't had abortion rights in this country since the Hyde Amendment in 1979, when Medicaid funding was taken away. So, and I can see that, I think that there's a lot of resentment that women feel because of what's happening, and unfortunately it's being manipulated in some cases onto trans people.
Many more things I want to say and ask you, but we're at time, and to Rob's point, I really could just sit and hold on, I took my camera away from myself. Rob, to Rob's point, I could just sit here all evening and listen to you talk, and this was just an incredible, enriching conversation. I think I'm I think I'm speaking for the entire group of people nodding their heads, and the work you've done. I mean, you know, it's a gift to all of us who are a part of you know, these communities and these struggles. And so I just want to thank you for that, and really to take your time with us tonight here in the little tiny state of Rhode Island. We are incredibly grateful. So
Thank you all so much. It was great to meet you.
Thank you
Thank you.
again.
you.
Yeah.
thank you, Sarah.
Thank you, Sarah.
Busy schedule, and
Thank you, Sarah.
for coming up with all of those wonderful questions. Thank you, everyone.
All right, we'll see you all.
All righty.